All right, thank you. When we opened this morning, we said one of the challenges was that we have to all go about doing a better job of telling the story of why we need permitting reform. And to close out our program today, we're joined by 4 industry experts from across various industries who all agree on one thing. In their industry, permitting reform is essential. So I'm going to introduce them, let them tell you a little bit about themselves, and then we're going to jump in. So immediately to my right is Shirley Bloomfield, the CEO of NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. Shirley, give us the elevator pitch on NTCA.
All right, the quick version is I represent 850 community-based providers who are bringing broadband to the most remote and rural parts of the country. We cover about 35% of the landmass, about 6% of the population. And while this is a broadband moment, there are certainly some hurdles ahead, and we're going to talk about that when we talk about streamlining permitting.
Excellent. Carrie Davis is the Vice President and General Counsel of the American Association of Port Authorities. You got from floor 2 to floor 4 to tell us about the Port Authority Association.
Good morning. Carrie Davis on behalf of the American Association of Port Authorities and on behalf of 85 deep draft ports across the United States. People ask me, well, how many shipping ports or how many maritime ports are there in the United States? There are about 340 of them. They come in all shapes and sizes. They're along our coasts. They're along our rivers. And the maritime and port shipping system is directly and indirectly responsible for an astounding 31 million jobs across our economy and $5.5 trillion of commerce. Whenever I'm downtown here in DC or go up to Capitol Hill to talk about the importance of ports, I think about the fact that our United States Capitol was built by canal and maritime shipping. And very proud to be the voice for all of those workers in commerce here in Washington, D.C.
The canal, now known as Constitution Avenue, I believe. Tom Smith, the Executive Director of the American Society of Civil Engineers.
Thank you, Neil. Good morning, everybody. Tom Smith with ASCE. We're a 501c3 organization, and we're the civil engineers who design the Capitol and ports and everything else, the infrastructure in this country and across the world. We have 150,000 members in 177 countries. And we design, build, operate, and maintain our world's infrastructure. And obviously, we're focused very heavily on making sure we do that in a way that is sustainable, resilient, and future ready. So we connect civil engineers with other civil engineers in the public and with information all across the world. We have a fairly strong public policy presence, but we are a 501c3. We're a technical, scientifically based organization. Many of us know us for a report card on America's infrastructure around Capitol Hill, but really what we're doing is developing standards and publications and training programs, and we're preparing engineers so that practice throughout their careers.
And Ann Bradbury is the President and CEO of the American Exploration and Production Council. Ann?
Ann Bradbury with AXPC. We represent the leading independent oil and gas producers in the United States from about a dozen different states in every major producing basin, from Appalachia to Texas and New Mexico, North Dakota, and all the producing areas in between. Independents actually produce about 80% of all the oil in this country and almost 90% of all the natural gas domestically. And we like to say that we're the authors of the American energy revolution, which is the shale revolution, which brought America from a place of energy scarcity to energy abundance. And as part of that, we were able to provide low and stable energy prices here domestically, which brought manufacturing back to the US, really drove a lot of our economic growth while also reducing emissions more than any other country in the world.
Okay, so 4 different industries, 4 different, I suspect we'll find out, distinct sets of problems, but all tied into permitting. Let's dive into that a little bit. Shirley, talk to us a little bit about how the lack of a reform permitting system hinders, presumably, rural broadband deployment.
All right, so just sharing, we, again, when I think about the parts of our country that my member companies who are, again, community-based providers, whether they're cooperatives or whether they're family-owned or community-held, are really building broadband as quickly as they can. Because if there's one thing that we learned during the pandemic is that connecting all Americans is really critical job one. And we had nothing to do with the capital, however, and I feel kind of badly about that. But because my guys are in the remote rural parts of the country. But when we talk about trying to get broadband as quickly out there as possible, I think about during the pandemic in 2019, federal government started putting a lot of funding out there. And so, for example, USDA has a program called the Reconnect program, which was putting, now a couple $1 billion into broadband in these markets. I had a company who literally in the height of the pandemic had to build across a BLM road. It took 18 months for that permit to be given. And when you build in some of these remote areas, particularly in the northern part of the United States, you might miss a build season by the time the permit actually comes through. So here was a community that was going to get fiber to the home that suddenly had to wait for a couple of years to actually get some of the permitting through. I literally have about 500 of my member companies in town today ready to hit the hill. And I asked one of them what kind of things that they're facing on the ground. He said, I've got this elderly woman I am trying to build network out to. Her family is anxious for her to get connected. And he said, I've got the guy who owns the land around her is looking for $10,000 in easements for me to just connect this one customer, going through the land. We also have a lot of issues, frankly, that involve railroads. It's amazing how difficult that is, but when you need to bore fiber, to hit that community that is waiting for upgraded technology, railroads, there are a lot of railroads in rural America, take my word for that, but you've got to actually bore through that and get the work with the railroads. All of these things lead to delays, to the inability for some of these companies to actually reach these consumers as quickly as possible. So whether it's tribal concerns or BLM or Forest Service, we tend to see it all, and then we also have some of those challenges on the local front as well. But just throwing a couple of examples, showing you the real world experience.
And at the end of the day, what it means is communities, households, small businesses just don't get connected. They wait.
They're still waiting, and they look at all this federal funding coming down, and they're like, that's amazing. There's $65 billion in the IIJA. That money can't translate down unless you can actually get the shovels into the ground, and that's a really important part of the project.
Carrie, I guess it was last summer, we spent a lot of time talking about ports and wait times and understanding what was going on with cargo throughout the United States. How does permitting factor into the ability to get goods in and out of the country and where we want them?
Great. So, Neil, there's no doubt about it that the funding that's available and getting shovels in the ground is important for modernizing and expanding our port system so that issues like that don't happen again. I'm going to start my short narrative similar to how Shirley did with the funding that's available. So and I'm always intimidated speaking to a group like this because I feel like a CBO person is going to call me out. But my best estimate is that the entire federal budget since 2014, fiscal year 2014, has increased about 71%. Everything our federal government spends funding on, from military to schools, 71%. The funding for intermodal freight activities at seaports has increased 430% over that time. So you might say, well, how then does something like what happened over the pandemic happen? We can talk about that and unpack it. But the point is, there's unprecedented, the point is, policymakers ought to be applauded because they understand the criticality of our intermodal freight system and of international trade to the health of the American economy. A secondary point is that there's unprecedented funding opportunities available, but we really get hamstrung when it comes to putting shovels in the ground and putting the funding to work. These projects are so important to modernizing our system that in the last round of port infrastructure funding projects, there was a dock in Port Angeles, Washington, which will be replaced if they can cut through the red tape and get the project underway. It's taking some time. It's 112 years old. AAPA was founded 112 years ago here in Washington. So that dock was built the same year that AAPA was founded here in Washington. It's incredibly important to cut through the red tape and get the dollars in the ground. So when I keep saying red tape, what does that look like? A refrain that I think many of the industry and policymaker folks that you've heard today say is there is a shortage of workers. They're badly needed at the federal agencies in order to review and give their stamp of approval to these projects. There are, I have a feeling I'll get some head nods, it's a sophisticated group, categorical exclusions. This is a no-brainer, common sense, bipartisan tool that any agency has to forego an environmental review if it's already been done by some other agency. But agencies are remiss and just generally slow to give their stamp of approval on these categorical exclusions. I understand that the list of approved categorical exclusions at the Maritime Administration for port infrastructure projects was typed on a typewriter and hasn't been updated since.
That bears repeating. So the current list of categorical exclusions is pre-personal computer?
Pre-PC, it was in an era when the entire purpose and infrastructure around a port was way different than we think about them today. Today, most especially if you look at the US's competitors in Europe and Southeast Asia, they're using more modern equipment, terminals, automation, intermodal rail connections that come right onto dock. I mean, I could list off all these technical things that ports are doing, but the very concept of what a port facility was completely different 40 some odd years ago when that list was generated. So I'm going to stop there, but you can see that permitting really gets in the way of modernizing and expanding our port infrastructure.
But it's shared on a mimeograph machine too. Tom, you have a great vantage point because you get to work with engineers really across all the things that we build in the United States. What do they tell you? What do you hear from them about permitting?
Yeah, well, you know, Kerry's example of 100-year-old infrastructure, I mean, that's not unusual at all in this country. 50, 75, 100 or more years old, that's what got us into the predicament that we're in. And that's why this Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that we have a lot of us here in the room work so closely on is so critical. But we're really never, to get the amount of the maintenance money that we need, you know, this 1.2 trillion over 5 years, and you look at, we do this report card, we look at 17 categories of infrastructure, and our needs are much, much greater than that to maintain the infrastructure we have and to be future ready. And you heard Senator Carper talking about extreme weather events and rising sea levels. We have to think differently now looking in the future than we did in the past, vastly different than when this infrastructure was designed. So now we're all excited. We have this investment. It's a historic investment. We need a lot more. So we have to maximize the efficiency when implementing this investment. We have to do it in a way that's sustainable, resilient, that's going to be able to withstand these things that we heard Senator Carper talking about. So in order to do that, we have got to be much more efficient in how we do it. When we waste during that process, it costs everybody money, including taxpayers. One of the things we do when we were advocating for investment in infrastructure is do economic studies. What does it cost when you fail to act? What are the hidden taxes that citizens pay when we delay and fail to invest in infrastructure? $3,300 per family per year. Easily quantifiable, easy to understand. We sit in traffic. Added costs of goods and services. So now when you add time in the permitting process, so we teach all of our members, you know, you're going to plan, design, build, operate, maintain, and then repurpose infrastructure. What happens now is you plan, wait for 5, 7, 10 years, you know, and then you can finish your design, build, operate, you know, and then anywhere in that process there may be more permitting that's required that can delay the process. Federal, state, local level. Permitting is important. It's critical. We have to engage the community. We got to look at the environment. We got historical issues. Civil engineers are very involved in every step of that process and are very strong advocates for every step in that process. But we have to be far more efficient in how we do it. We're losing global competitiveness. We're watching what's going on in other countries. We're constantly looking at China, look at high-speed rail throughout Europe and Asia. And you say, well, what's the issue? Well, I mean, there are differences, obviously, versus democracies and other governments. But we can be far more efficient in how we do it here. Our infrastructure globally, when we look at our global competition, you know, we're not in the top 10 in the world. We need to be there again. And this historic investment is great. But we've got to do it efficiently. We've got to deliver on what the American public has promised, you know, what we've promised to them by making this investment. So, you know, this is great news that we got this historic investment, but we absolutely have to make sure we do it right. pick the right projects, and then implement them. And that means being much more efficient. And we've got a policy that we've had in place for 20 years on single point of a source for review of these permits and making sure that there's enforceable timelines, as we heard the senator talk about this morning. We've been pushing this for a long time. This is a bipartisan issue, so civil engineers feel very strongly about this.
And when we think about energy over the last 2 decades, we often think of the great success story is the fracking revolution, and that somehow we managed to do something that no one anticipated that we would be able to do in terms of meeting our own energy needs and a lot of the global energy needs. Yet permitting's still a hindrance for your members and your industry. Tell us a little bit about what the holdups are.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you 2 sort of general examples. Number one, and Senator Manchin touched on this, Appalachian Basin is the most prolific natural gas field in the world. Natural gas, as you know, is one of the cleanest, most transportable, affordable fuels available today. But because of limited infrastructure capacity, Senator Manchin talked about Mountain Valley Pipeline, that's been in the news a lot, but there have been 6 different pipelines that have either been entirely canceled or delayed over the last several years. So pipeline capacity out of that basin is maxed out, which means that there are places in the United States just a few hundred miles to the north that have no access to clean American-made natural gas. So that's why you see the only LNG import facility in the country is in Massachusetts, and it imports natural gas from places like Trinidad or Russia even, despite the fact that the world's most prolific natural gas field is just a few hundred miles to the south. And that is because we can't build pipelines up to the northeast. So they're either importing LNG, they're reliant on heating oil, which is very expensive and emits more than natural gas. So there are regionally there are huge places in the United States, both particularly in the Northeast, but also in the Southeast, that are at a huge disadvantage because they are not able to access the abundant resources here in the United States. So that's one example. Well, actually, I'll just add to that. Building on that, we saw how critical American energy is to the world over the last year. And if we can't get out of the basin, we're not going to be able to ramp it up to our international partners as well. So there are places in the world that are clamoring for US LNG. We want to be able to provide it to them, but we're going to need more infrastructure to be able to do that sufficiently. Secondly, we also represent some of the biggest producers on federal land here in the U.S. Federal land represents about 10% of all domestic production of oil and natural gas. But that's a significant amount when you're talking about the world's biggest energy producer. 10% is a significant amount. And because of the myriad of permits that you need to produce on federal lands, whether it's APDs, rights of way, or so on and so forth, companies are subject to an enormous amount of delay and uncertainty in getting these permits, and it makes it an increasingly risky and uncertain place to do business. So you're seeing more and more production shift away from federal lands, which hurts federal revenue. It hurts the states where these federal lands happen, because this is an enormous part of their state revenue as well, because of the risks associated with all of the different permits that are needed, the lengths of time it takes to receive those permits. One example is if you're looking for an APD in Texas, it takes about usually 6 days to get that APD approved. If you're on the New Mexico side on federal lands, it usually takes a year or more to get that APD approved. So clearly, if you have the ability to produce either of those places, that's why a lot of people go to Texas over New Mexico. So that's just another example of how permitting and the problems with permitting are really stifling our ability to unleash American energy.
We were talking about some of the barriers here and how close things are and you can't get them where they need to be. It occurred to me that 150, 100 years ago, our barriers were natural, right? Like we couldn't get something across a river. We couldn't traverse a mountain range. We've actually invented things that allow us to get past those natural barriers. our biggest barriers now are we can't get permission to get past those natural barriers, which is it feels like a self-inflicted problem when you think about the context of it. Carrie, I want to go to you and Tom next. You both mentioned global competitiveness, and I'm wondering if you can spend a moment, and Carrie, we'll go to you first, about your global industry, what our inability to build here means for U.S. global competitiveness in the economy.
Right, so the term supply chain, everyone's woke to supply chain right now. Supply chain challenges, whether we're policymakers in Washington talking about our military supply chains or our PPE supply chains, or you're anyone in this room connected with any company in America that makes or manufactures or sells anything. You're woke to the importance of secure, resilient supply chains. So my first thought and reaction is a little bit of a pat on my own back, a little bit of pat on our industry's back. Not for a day, not for one day did our ports close in this country due to the pandemic, and that was in stark contrast with what happened with ports in other countries. So I just want to remind everyone that. But of course, apropos of what Tom's been talking about and Senator Carper was talking about with more extreme weather events and resiliency for new threats, whether they be cyber threats to our critical infrastructure and our goods movement chain infrastructure, or extreme weather events including sea level rise, more intensive storms, and too much draw on the grid, which can shut down operations too. We, of course, want to build infrastructure that is more resilient. I'm going to shift very briefly to what we're seeing internationally. I was just visited by a port that shall remain nameless, who is desperately in need of investment, and the Chinese approached them and said, we will essentially rebuild your port completely. And in order to do that and prepare for that, please provide us with all of the maps of the critical mineral mines in and around the port complex, and give us the flow charts of how the critical minerals flow. And oh, by the way, you can pay us back in your critical minerals. So this is, of course, part of a Chinese plan, a little thing called Belt and Road, to maintain access and arguably domination of critical trade infrastructure around the world. But we've got to wake up and understand the importance of our critical trading infrastructure and supply chains.
Tom, how do you see the global competitive landscape?
Yeah, just that there are innovative projects taking place all over the world. You know, we're working on an IMAX film right now called Cities of the Future that's looking at future-ready cities. And you know, we were just filming in Singapore and Amsterdam, and incredible projects that you see that are taking place. Obviously, there are projects in the United States too. But we have got, in order to be competitive, we've got to streamline and expedite the process, because we've got our own engineers working on projects in other countries, and we got to make sure that we have projects here and we're attracting engineers from all over the world to be working in the United States as well. So high-speed rail was a good example, though, 15,000 plus miles in China, and you go throughout Asia, and the difficulties in the permitting process alone you know, are indicative of some of the issues we have. So in order to be globally competitive, we've got to streamline the process. I think everyone's got to recognize that.
Shirley, what is it that Congress could do that would alleviate some of the problems that you talked about?
Well, and it's really timely that we're having this conversation, right, with the House Energy and Commerce Committee having a hearing focused on just that tomorrow. So again, you know, I think when I think about the historic amount of money, you know, I mentioned the B to 65 billion. There's 10 billion from Treasury. There's another 2+ coming at USDA. I think there's a couple of things that are very top of mind for us in the broadband space. One is there are a lot of agencies that now have their finger in the broadband pot. So what we can do in terms of agency coordination, that's not necessarily streamlining, but it is common sense governance. It is literally having these agencies talk to one another. The other thing is the BEAD funding and the Reconnect funding are all under federal purview. well, that means they all actually have to have another look at. So even if you have previously disturbed territory, which, again, if you've built broadband, probably 10 years, 15 years ago, you were putting DSL or copper in. Well, now you're putting in fiber. It's previously disturbed. Thinking about where that redundancy is, thinking about things like the shot clock. How do we make sure that these things, I served on the BDAC for the FCC, which was focused on streamlining 5 years ago. I feel like we're still having the same conversations over and over again. And I think Carrie hit on a really important point. It is not just the workforce I see in the broadband space that Congress should be focused on, but honestly, it is the workforce that is at these federal agencies to get the job done. When I hear that there is one person in the counsel's office at USDA who is not just focused on getting all the paperwork through for broadband, but every other program USDA has, we have got to be thinking about, you've appropriated this money and authorized this money for building, but how do we ensure that these agencies have the staff to clear through the BLM or to clear through the USDA regulatory process? That is really an important, I know it's not sexy, but it is critically, critically important that we think about some of that.
So I want to talk about how we get some of that stuff and the other permitting reforms done. Tom, you were a keynote speaker when we kicked off Build by the 4th of July to try to get the infrastructure bill done. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of people had a lot of doubts about the idea of trying to set a deadline and that we could actually get Congress, after almost 2 decades, to get something done. How do you view this effort relative to the effort that went into getting the infrastructure bill enacted?
Yeah, I think it's fairly similar. I think it's, it requires bipartisan action. It requires coalitions like the folks here in the room and that are watching. It's going to require that level of effort, which is why I'm glad to see, look at, the work that the chamber is doing to promote this. When you talked about the global issue as well, Leo Marino talked about how other countries add a sense of urgency. We all need to add a sense of urgency. Look when the Fern Hollow Bridge collapsed in Pittsburgh. I was just at the ENR dinner last week where they're recognizing the ENR newsmakers. One of them was the project manager. 10 months it took to build the new bridge. It's got there's some historic sites near there. There's a park underneath it that's got environmental considerations. They extended the sidewalk for biking. It had a lot of considerations that are very, very important and that were given due consideration, engaging the community. But they did the entire thing in 10 months. It can be done. We've shown how it can be done. We just have to have that level of urgency in everything that we do.
I like that, urgency. That may be the watchword of the day. So, Ann, in addition to kind of representing America's energy producers, you're one of the most keen observers of Capitol Hill, given your, I won't say how many years of experience at the senior levels in the House of Representatives. Given your insider perspective and knowledge, how should we be thinking about this? What should people be doing? How do we create that sense of urgency that Tom talked about?
That's a great question, and Neil, I'll just say it's such a pleasure to be up here with you after spending so many years with you on the Hill. So first I'll say, I do think that this is a really unique moment in time that you and I both know that while I think conventional wisdom sometimes says you don't get anything done during gridlock, that's actually when you get some of the most important things done and some of the most durable things done. And keeping it sort of in the energy space, I look back at the lifting of the oil export ban, which happened under a divided Congress. And so I think divided Congress is actually a really important opportunity to get things done. So I'm excited about that. I also think the other ingredient here that exists here that needs to exist is an urgency from both sides, right? We've seen Republicans kind of put forth, HR 1, their permitting bill, clearly, a #1 priority for them to get energy permitting done from their perspective. And we've heard from, this really diverse cast of speakers, both today and other times in Washington, from the other side of the aisle about how they know that to fully implement the IRA and to fully to fully realize the vision that they have of, building out the renewable grid and, the renewable energy goals of this administration, that they need permitting reform as well. So everybody's got some skin in the game, which is what is super critical right now. I think that, we're early in the process, but, discussions like this to continue to move the ball forward is what's really needed. And I'm really optimistic about this opportunity this year.
So if I can sum this up, real world implications for families and businesses, even in the most remote corners of the United States, an impact on our global competitiveness and everything that we want to do being a leader in the world. The missing ingredient, the sense of urgency to get this done, and the ability to seize on the opportunity of a rare moment of bipartisan agreement really is the right recipe of good stories, factual examples, and great opportunity to get much needed permitting reform done. So please join me in thanking our panelists today.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you.